Yeah, it's been a real, I guess, journey to get to this point. The office has only been in existence for a couple of months, and I have to acknowledge the team that's been formed to support the office. That's Nita and Sue, Tim and Margot. So collectively amongst the five of us in a relatively short time, within 2 months, we've been able to talk to a number of stakeholders and actually develop a bit of the vision around where we think the leading gateway vision for Christchurch could be. So what I'd like to do tonight is work through what being a gateway city means, because it's quite important that we understand, I guess, the roles and responsibilities around being a gateway. We'll look at what Christchurch as a gateway is today. The main focus of the talk is really about what constitutes a leading gateway city and some of the preconditions or outcomes that are required. And that's really the vision about where we want to get to for Christchurch itself. And then we'll cover briefly some opportunities as to how we can close that gap as well. So let's start with a definition of what a gateway city is. And it's really, I guess, the traditional form is that it's really just an entry or exit point for the movement of goods, trades and people. So that can refer to things like border crossings or, in our case, an Antarctic gateway. But the more contemporary definition of a gateway city really looks at the value-added part of it. It's really about the creation and delivery of innovation, knowledge and information. So it's more than just the transmission of goods and services across a particular point. So just to remind ourselves, there are 5 global Antarctic gateway cities, including Christchurch. We've got Hobart, Australia, we've got Cape Town in South Africa, Punta Arenas in Chile, and Ushuaia in Argentina. And occasionally we talk about Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands as well. But generally that's considered there are five gateway cities. And the key thing in terms of those gateway cities is that we're not talking necessarily about the traditional view of competition between gateway cities. When I first started in this role 2 months ago, there was very much a focus on Christchurch being the premier gateway city in the world. And the whole concept, I guess, around the early consideration of the gateway city was that we were in competition with Hobart. There was a sense that if we didn't do things better, then the American program in particular would go to Hobart. So there was this whole sense around competition. But in the 2 months that I've been in the role, and certainly talking to a number of stakeholders and getting a better appreciation of what a gateway city is, it's not about competition, but it's about creating a differentiated advantage for Christchurch in itself. So it's actually about the complementarity that Christchurch as a gateway city has with Hobart, has with Cape Town, and has with the other 2 South American countries. And in fact, in recent discussions in the last couple of weeks, there's been a real strong effort, particularly from the Chilean and Argentinian side, to look at creating a collective opportunity around each of the 5 gateway cities. And you remember on this particular picture here, collectively we all span the sub-Antarctic or Southern Ocean areas. And so there's been a recognition that if we have a collective action on these issues, then we can actually start to develop better policy around things like illegal fishing or tourism or minerals exploitation. So that's a really important consideration to think about the strategy as we develop it. The other thing which has become quite apparent is that we've moved away from this idea that we're a gateway purely to Antarctica. And in fact, the discussion is more about the role of the gateway city to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, and its connection between, I guess, mainland New Zealand and Antarctica. And it's also extended beyond the simple consideration of the land and sea as well, and we need to consider the sky elements as well. So, for example, Project Sophia from the NASA program is also part of our consideration around a gateway city. And the other, I guess, evolution in the thinking is that it's not just a story around the local boundaries of Christchurch. This is a story that actually transcends the local boundaries, and it actually is about Christchurch's role as a New Zealand or national gateway to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And again, this is quite a significant change from where we were 2 months ago, and it's actually a really important driver in terms of the strategy, which I'll talk about a little bit later. So if we go back to that definition about what constitutes a gateway city, the whole strategy is around enhancing New Zealand's nodal centre, which is based here in Christchurch, for the creation and delivery of Antarctic and Southern Ocean innovation, knowledge and information. And again, it's that last part of that sentence which is actually quite critical. So it's doing more than what we're currently doing at the moment. What that means is part of this discussion tonight. So why should we care about being a gateway city? In my previous role in the Mayor's office, we had ongoing discussions around what should the city be after the earthquakes. What was the actual purpose of the city? We had the moniker Christchurch as a garden city, but the images that portrayed were very much around the conservative view of Christchurch. It was very old-fashioned, if you like. And there was constant discussions around Christchurch as being an innovation centre. We talked about smart cities, we talked about Garden City 2.0 and so on. But the common feature amongst all of that was a need to actually redefine Christchurch in a completely different way. The Antarctic strategy, which we'll talk about, is actually building upon some of those innovation themes, and it actually is an important part of redefining what Christchurch is. The other part as to why we should care about Christchurch being an Antarctic gateway city is that it helps create a sense of place. And having a sense of place is really important, actually defining what a city is. And it starts to define the purpose and the direction of industry, for example. It starts to define the sense of tourism within a particular city. And without a sense of place, it's really hard to actually define what a city is. And we'll talk more about that as well through the discussion. And finally, we should care about Christchurch being a strong Antarctic gateway, because if we're a strong and effective gateway, then we add substantially to New Zealand's influence on the world stage. And this is very much front and centre in terms of the recent thinking around the role of the gateway and the role of the city and actually supporting New Zealand's diplomatic effort around Antarctic and Southern Ocean issues. So where did the goal of being a leading Antarctic gateway come from? Well, this has been around for a long time, and I guess the birth of the Antarctic Office has been many a year. So the need was first identified in 2002, and there was a group that was born out of the council through the Antarctic Link Canterbury, which really started to try and identify how we could maximise some of the economic returns associated with the Antarctic industry. But for various reasons that fell into sort of decline and sort of disappeared from the scene. And it wasn't really until 2007 that there was a mayoral visit to Hobart, which started to create the idea that we need to, as a city, start to maximise our returns on the Antarctic industry. And out of that visit came something which was known as Project Antarctica, and it started to identify the need for what was called in those days an Antarctic Support Office. And the need to have a strategy across the whole city that started to bring together all of the Antarctic players within the city. But again, for various reasons, the idea sort of died a bit of a death and really didn't take off. And it wasn't until 2014 when the current Mayor, Leanne Dalzell, was voted into office that she actually picked up the challenge of what we do as a leading gateway city and made it part of her one of her 3 key priorities. And so as a result of that, the City Council made a 10-year commitment to fund the Antarctic Office out of the LTP, the long-term plan, and actually as a way of kick-starting the work that needed to be done within the city. And as a result of that commitment by the Council, we now have the Antarctic Office, which, as I said, has been in operation for a couple of months now. So where are we today? The good thing in terms of Christchurch is that there are a number of activities that could relate to the gateway function. So on this side, we've got the number of national Antarctic programs. We've got Antarctica New Zealand, we've got the US Antarctic program, we've got the Italians, and we've got the Koreans. We've also got within the city a number of organisations that also contribute to the Antarctic gateway role. So we've got the Antarctic Society, we've got the International Antarctic Centre, Gateway Antarctica, of course, and the Antarctic Heritage Trust. We also have ComNap, who are based here in Christchurch, adding to our sort of capability and our status. We also have IceFest, which is conducted every 2 years out of the City Council. We have the museum, and we also have a number of other bits and pieces through the city that actually reflect the Antarctic gateway role. So in the last discussion, the value of the Antarctic industry was identified at around about 103 million based on the work that Lincoln University do. And you can see here that the majority of the value of the industry is really in the national programs, and most of those national programs are dominated by the US Antarctic program. We also have tourism generating about $31 million worth of activity, and fishing as well, which was quite a surprise to me, around about 23 million. And then small contributions from education and heritage. So the difficulty, though, that when you look at the structure of the Christchurch Gateway agencies, is that we're very much based on a silo approach. Everybody's doing their job reasonably well, but there's nothing that actually connects any of the organisations together. And that was a problem that was identified way back in 2007. And so in terms of the thrust of the strategy, which I'll talk about soon, what we're trying to do is really shift the behaviour away from being a commodity focus, and to use sort of that business parlance, really where we're just acting as a logistics hub or just ticking things over. We're really looking at how we move more towards actually creating some value associated with that activity, creating the value proposition, and getting a lot more value out of the connections that we currently have. And to do that, we actually need to take quite an aspirational view. There's no point in just carrying on doing what we're doing and pretending that we can do it a little bit better. We actually have to have quite a significant game change in order to be able to extract some of that value and actually create that proposition that Christchurch is a leading Antarctic gateway. And it also requires significant commitment from some of the key agencies involved in the city, as well as central government. And it also requires quite a significant degree of bravery. I think my experience in terms of doing some of this change management work, actually having some of the strategy development, is that you actually have to be quite brave and you have to be prepared to take calculated risks around these things. So we do need to go into this with a fair degree of bravery rather than, I guess, just shy away from the challenge. So in terms of creating value, what do we mean around creating value? Well, if we look at the material that Lincoln University has produced around the value of the Antarctic industry, we can see way back in 2007 they calculated it at around about 88 million. In 2013 it was about 103 million in total for the Canterbury economy. In 2015 there is an increase. That figure isn't publicly released yet, but it is higher than what it was in 2013. And you can see that over time we can expect a sort of a gradual increase in the value of the Antarctic industry in Christchurch. But what we really need to do is actually shift that curve quite significantly. We need to actually change it so that the value that we create is significantly higher. If we create more GDP, then we create more income, we create more employment and so on. So in a sense, we're creating value between where we are at the moment and where we could be in the future. And we're doing that through a whole series of potential opportunities that we believe sit out there in both Christchurch and New Zealand. And in terms of, I guess, just a very quick assessment, we can see that we're doing reasonably well in things like the National Antarctic programs. We're doing reasonably well in terms of hospitality. We're doing reasonably well in terms of logistics support to the Antarctic side. But where we can do gain some advantages really in the shipping services, in education, research and science, potentially in heritage, certainly in events and certainly in the visitor area as well. And then there are a number of sectors within the economy where we think we can actually get quite a significant advantage. Areas like professional services, certainly industry and in the innovation sector, some professional services, engineering, fishing management, construction, and comms and IT. So in terms of the opportunity, at the moment we've been focusing very much on these sorts of areas, but we need to take a much broader and much more aspirational approach. Alternatively, if we think about if we don't do anything and we just carry along this particular path, we need to turn the story around. And in fact, what we end up with is actually losing an opportunity as a city around the Antarctic story. So with that bit of background, I'd just like to go through what we think are the preconditions or outcomes that are required if we think that Christchurch is actually a leading gateway city. And we've identified, as a result of the work that's been done over the years, plus confirmed in quite a number of the stakeholder engagement meetings we've had in the last couple of months, we've identified 4 sets of outcomes which we think actually constitute positions that Christchurch needs to reach if it wants to be a leading gateway city. The first one is that it needs to be internationally recognised as a city that actually actively supports Antarctic endeavours. It needs to have depth in its Antarctic capability and credibility so that it actually can participate on the world stage. It needs to maximise its economic development opportunities, and it needs to have a higher level of awareness around Antarctica and Southern Ocean issues, particularly amongst the community. So I'd just like to take each of those points and just work through what we mean by that. So if we're going to be a leading gateway city that's actually internationally recognised, we need to create, again, using business language, what we call a unique visitor proposition. The visitor strategy, which has been developed for the city, actually talks about the need to define the city in a way that actually is quite different from the rest of the country, and it was also quite different from the rest of the world. So if you think about that image, for example, you can instantly know where that icon is located. Similarly with that one there, you know where that city is based on that particular building, and that one as well. And so the visitor strategy really talked about the need to understand what is the unique proposition that Christchurch has. And the Antarctic story was one of those that was identified. There were only three. The earthquakes, unfortunately, it could be defining for the city. There's the Ngāi relationship, and there's the Antarctic relationship. Anybody know this particular building? Bilbao, yeah. So Bilbao is a really interesting case study where a value proposition was built for a city that was actually in decline. So this is the Guggenheim Museum in Spain, in Bilbao in Spain. And it was developed on portland in the city that acted really as an economic stimulus for the city itself. But the impact of the development was quite substantial. So the city had to invest 100 million euros into building this particular building. And they had an expectation that it would actually start to draw some level of visitors to the city. But within 4 years, it had actually generated a huge level of interest. And it actually defined Bilbao as the centre for contemporary art and culture within Europe. And so it had the significant effect of actually regenerating and reinventing the city to the point where it was described, I guess, in the business world as the Bilbao effect, where something which was relatively small actually defined the city quite significantly. So this has become a really big success story for the city and has actually helped in terms of that sense of place that I mentioned earlier. So if we're going to be a leading gateway city that's actually recognised, we also have to have something that's actually quite iconic and unique to the city. And this is a concept diagram that was developed in 2014 by Warren and Marnie for the current Antarctic site out at the airport. And although this is just a proposal and it's definitely not, there's nothing in the planning stage at this point, this resonated to me as something that's actually iconic. So I currently work in a building which is relatively bland, it's quite flat, it's quite white. There's nothing that actually tells you that it has any reference to Antarctica. The Antarctic attraction is next door to it, and that has a few signs and so on. But generally, there's nothing around that site that actually screams out Christchurch's relationship to Antarctica. So something like this, with its sort of iceberg shapes and so on, actually tells the visitor, without even having to go inside the building, that there's a reference to Antarctica. I think this proposal also talked about having 52 flags for all the signatory nations as well, so that actually reinforces this idea of being an iconic site in the same way, for example, that the UN does with its flags. So this, for me, is a sort of an aspirational thing that we have to also think about as a city. But it's not just about creating an iconic site out at the airport. As a city itself, we also need to actually be defined around the Antarctic connection. So it doesn't matter whether you're in Worcester Boulevard or whether you're down in Cashel Street or whether you're down in Sumner. There are things that actually remind you about the Antarctic story in Christchurch. So whether that's actually things like statues, whether it's place names, whether it's exhibitions or whatever, as a city, I think we really need to expand what we currently do in that area. And the third part, which would define us as a leading gateway city, and we get this international recognition, is when we're recognised as a centre of excellence. And we'll talk more about what that means in terms of research and science in particular a little bit later. The other outcome which starts to define Christchurch as a leading Antarctic gateway city is when we're starting to maximise what I've called the depth. Now this is something which, again, has sort of come really out of central government's view around the Christchurch as an Antarctic gateway. What the discussion has really started to develop is this idea that without this depth and the capability in Christchurch, the New Zealand diplomatic effort overseas is relatively shallow. All it is talk. And unless we have a very strong industry base, unless we have a very strong research and science base, unless we have a population that actually appreciates the Antarctic story, then it's incredibly difficult to actually get some influence in terms of world discussions on Antarctic or Southern Ocean issues. So we can say that Christchurch has depth when we actively have infrastructure in the city that supports Antarctic and Southern Ocean operations. So that's things like the port, the airport, IT and communications. We have a good transport network and so on. So at the moment we have a very good airport that supports the Antarctic programs, but we have differing levels of support from the port company, which we're working on. We have also differing levels of IT and comm support as well associated with the infrastructure. Our depth is also maximised when Christchurch is leading Antarctic science and research through being proactively involved in globally significant projects. And the reason why this is important is because what we're trying to do here in the end is create a knowledge base around Antarctic issues so that New Zealand and Christchurch in particular starts to inform policy development. One of the biggest problems that some of the stakeholders have identified around the whole Antarctic story is that we have a very good science community, but what we're not very good at, and I think this is a global problem as well, what we're not very good at is actually translating that science into policy work. And so New Zealand and Christchurch in particular has a real opportunity to be part of that forefront around translating that science into the so what story. And if we do that, then ideally we become the preferred base for collaboration on Antarctic and Southern Ocean issues. And the vehicle that's being proposed for that collaboration is the National Antarctic Research and Science Hub. And some of you may know that as the Antarctic Endeavour in previous iterations. But this is about creating a national capability based here in Christchurch that actually supports the Antarctic and Southern Ocean research. The difficulty that we have as a country is that, again, we have very good scientists, but what we don't have is the infrastructure. And this project has been around for a number of years in response to that particular problem. And we've developed a business case through the Better Business Case methodology, the central government methodology. And it's shown that there's a very strong strategic case to have this particular facility based here in Christchurch. And just in short form, it's effectively based around the use of modular laboratories. So the research community can come in and they can actively use the research space. They're supported by their peers, they're supported by all the technology and technicians and so on. All of the specialist equipment is based at this particular facility. So the scientists effectively come in and out of this particular facility at a much cheaper cost than it would occur if they had to go down onto the ice. The other advantage that Christchurch has around this particular science hub is that Christchurch in particular has the strategic advantage of being able to take the samples, whether it's rocks or marine life or water from Antarctica, and being able to bring it straight to Christchurch without having to go through the quarantine requirements or restrictions. So having a biosecure facility based out at the airport actually creates quite a significant advantage for Christchurch. The discussions that we've had over a number of years with international partners in particular, they've expressed considerable interest in this because they can see the huge value that this creates around the science budget, for example. So instead of having scientists who are based in the ice for potentially weeks or months on end at huge cost, they can actually go out and collect some of the samples and then come back to Christchurch and actually conduct with a much reduced cost, they can actually conduct more science. So we're going to go through we do have a developer who's expressed interest in actually building this particular facility. So the challenge that we now need to do as through the Antarctic office is actually identify the commercial model that would allow this to operate. The third outcome that actually defines Christchurch as a leading gateway city is when we're maximising our economic development. And we can see that when Christchurch becomes a hub for I guess an industry cluster based around Antarctic and Southern Ocean. And we'll talk about that again in the next couple of slides. We also see a number of businesses which are currently existing here, particularly in Christchurch, companies like Jade or Tate or even Trimble, for example, where they're actually able to leverage off their capabilities that they currently have and then operate in the Antarctic area. And finally, our economic development will be maximised when Christchurch and New Zealand business is seen as being globally competitive and technically advanced. What we're not interested in is actually supporting some of these industries just so that they survive. We're actually trying to create an environment where local industries can actually thrive and actually become globally competitive, and they're seen to be leaders in the Antarctic technology innovation space. So economic development will also be maximised when New Zealand firms are linked to some of the planned Antarctic rebuild programs. The US Antarctic program, for example, has announced maybe 3 or 4 months ago their intent to actually significantly rebuild McMurdo. And they've budgeted around about $350 million, and they expect to start that in 2019. Now, most of that work will occur through American subcontractors, but there's huge opportunities for New Zealand industry to be involved in that particular rebuild. Scott Base are also going through plans around a rebuild. We also know that the Italians particularly are looking at the creation of a permanent runway in Terranova Bay. And we also have some degree of confidence expressed by the Chinese that they will build another base within the Ross Sea area within the next 5 years. So collectively, we're looking potentially at about $1 billion worth of investment going into Antarctica over the next 10 to 15 years. And we need to get Christchurch firms and New Zealand firms actually able to operate within those procurement processes, particularly the US one. I think the reality is when you speak to the US Antarctic program, their initial thinking was that most of the skill sets and most of the materials, for example, we ship from mainland US. But as they've started to work through their logistics understanding and the constraints that those requirements would have, I think that the tension is now turning to Lyttelton and Christchurch being the forward operating base for much of that rebuild. We also need to think about Christchurch as what we've called in the past a living laboratory. So in my previous role with the Mayor's Office, we looked at Christchurch particularly as a smart city. And there were significant opportunities for Christchurch to be what we call this living lab, where the rebuild opportunities and the innovation sector that we already have within the city can start to build, I guess, this technology which can then be applied for commercial purposes elsewhere. So for Christchurch, what we have is a couple of areas where I think we can already start to build this living lab, particularly in the area around sensor technology. So we'll talk about the ComNap challenge in the next slide, but there's a real demand now for the science community to adopt sensor technology so that they're out there in the field collecting observations, whether it's wildlife or whether it's marine life or whatever. The challenge, though, is that the sensors need to be able to then communicate back to a base station, and then that data needs to then come back to New Zealand. The sensors also need to have a battery life as well, which allow them to be sustained out in the field. So sensor technology, although it's developing at a relatively high level, is still quite constrained in what it can do. So there are some significant opportunities for the innovation companies based here in Christchurch in New Zealand to be involved in that particular area. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but for me I think that's one of the biggest opportunities for the city. The other area where our economic development would be maximised is where our public infrastructure agencies, so that's CCHL, the airport, the City Council and Lyttelton Port, have their infrastructure plans actively engaged in terms of the Antarctic strategy. The difficulty we have in talking to these various agencies is that they have some ideas about where they'd like to go in terms of, for example, the port company has some ideas about where they'd like to go in terms of supporting the Antarctic side, but there's no overall strategy. Certainly the City Council similarly had some ideas about where they wanted to invest in order to be able to support the city's ambitions around Antarctica, but there was no strategy to actually guide some of those decisions. So the strategy which will be developed over the next couple of months is actually going to be a really critical way of actually incorporating some of these decisions around the future capital requirements for the city. So I mentioned the ComNap Innovation Challenge. ComNap have recently published what they've called the Antarctic Roadmap. And they've identified that a third of the required technology for future science is currently available, but it's only limited to a small number of scientists. They've identified that some of that technology is also available, but it needs improvements to be able to operate in that environment. So sensing technology, for example, is a good example of that. And they've also identified that there's a significant number of new technologies which haven't been developed yet, which will be required to support the requirements of future Antarctic science. They've also identified that those advances will come from outside the Antarctic science community. And again, if we think about it from the Christchurch and New Zealand perspective, we have some very good firms that can operate in that space, but there's no connection between the two at the moment. So the fourth precondition or outcome that actually defines Christchurch as a leading gateway is really where we're increasing awareness, the public awareness. And there are a number of different mechanisms or delivery vehicles we can use for this. We'll just talk about events first. I think if we were a leading gateway city, we would have actually a national ice festival as opposed to a local ice festival. And we've already got a corporate partner who's expressed some interest in using the values and the idea around IceFest and actually being able to translate that into something that actually is at the same level as the world of wearable arts, and it has the same impact for Wellington as world of wearable arts. We're expecting the IceFest would have the same impact for Christchurch. So people are actually drawn to the city, and then there's opportunity to engage around Antarctic and Southern Ocean issues. So we hope to be able to progress that in the next couple of months. We also will increase awareness through having Christchurch hosting globally significant events, whether that's conferences and so on. But what we also expect to be able to do, and I know that Chloe's been thinking about this as well in her role as Director of IceFest, is rather than rely on a 2-year IceFest process, we actually have a series of, or calendar of ongoing events that actually reinforce the message that we're trying to get around the role of the leading gateway city. We'll also increase awareness through engagement. I think there's a huge opportunity, particularly through the research hub, through the visitor attraction or the Antarctic attraction, and some of the other bits and pieces that will be developed, to really be a world leader in telling the so what story. I mentioned before that one of the frustrations that policymakers have in Wellington is that there's this lack of interpretation around the science outputs. I think, you know, there's also this lack of connection to you and I, well, certainly to me as a ratepayer and a resident of Christchurch. It's really difficult to understand what the science implications are and how they're going to impact me. But again, talking to stakeholders, there's certainly a very strong story here, but we just need to tell it in a different way. We'll also look at increasing engagement through what I've called think pieces on some of these issues. Now, I know these occur on a whole range of different levels throughout New Zealand, through the city, but we need actually to be seen as being a leader in stimulating some of those debates around Antarctic and Southern Ocean issues. And finally, we're looking at creating a number of strong memorandum of understandings with a number of key agencies. I mentioned at the beginning the desire of Hobart and Christchurch to work together around the gateway role. And there's certainly been a very strong push from Australia around trying to create those collaborations. We've also had very strong indications from the other gateway cities, in particular the South American cities, to create a bit more of a collaboration around the role of the gateway cities. And certainly Foreign Affairs, in the discussions I've been having with them, are very keen to see a grouping of countries that have gateway responsibilities to take some sort of guardianship of some of those sub-Antarctic and Antarctic issues. We're also looking at maximising awareness or increasing awareness through education as well. Now, I know that there are education or school resource kits being developed, but we also need to move towards having globally recognised institutions that actually lead Antarctic and Southern Ocean research and education. Now, we have Gateway Antarctica, of course, as a really good example of that already, but we also need a number of other institutions which can also add to that education as well. We also need to look at having a critical mass of research and science capability that actually allows for a more sustained presence on the world stage. So again, we have the difficult situation where individually scientists are acting on the world stage, but there's not the sustained presence. We have a workforce that's actually aware of Antarctica and Southern Ocean issues as well. And one of the ambitions that we would have is, for example, to have induction programs for new staff. And so, you know, one of the ideas is where hospitality industry new staff actually have an understanding of Antarctica and Southern Ocean. So when they're interacting with, you know, transiting scientists or support staff, they actually have an awareness or an understanding of why these people are in the city. And having an understanding of that actually creates a sense of ownership. So the Antarctic story becomes part of why they're actually employed. And the fourth part of it is moving towards a point where the Antarctic studies are part of the school curriculum. In my previous role, one of my previous roles in defence, I used to go to Canberra quite a bit. And the thing that struck me there was the number of school kids from around Australia who would go to the National War Museum. And it wasn't about learning about how war was glorified. It was actually about teaching Australian children the role of Australia in world politics and the world conflict. And so out of that became a really good awareness for these school kids around Australia's role in the world and the difficulties of global conflict. And so for me, I think if we achieve the same level of outcome around Antarctic studies and it was part of the school curriculum, I think again would have a much higher level of engagement and understanding about some of these issues. So those are the four sorts of outcomes that we're striving to achieve through the Antarctic strategy. But I just wanted to remind ourselves that doing nothing is not really an option. So we actually need to shift that curve, as I said in one of the previous slides. Otherwise, what we end up with is we have this untapped potential. We have an industry base here, which is currently not really focused on Antarctica. We have scientists who can't actually exploit their full potential because they don't have the facilities. We have a visitor attraction which is doing a good job, but there's a lot more that it can do. And if we don't actually tap into that potential, then we lose a lot of value as a city. We know that there are going to be geopolitical changes, whether we like it or not, and we know that the Chinese will build a base in the Ross Sea area within 5 years. They're extremely confident about that. We know that innovation will happen. We know that budget pressures will happen on science. And so, unless we're prepared to change, we're just going to be left behind potentially. We know that there are some big rebuild opportunities in Antarctica. What we need to do as a city and as a country actually get ourselves organised so that we can participate in that. You know, it's simple things as well. So, you know, the American procurement system work on the basis of imperial units. Everything that we do will tend to be in terms of metrics. So we just need to be able to operate in their procurement space. Otherwise, we're going to miss that completely. If we don't have a strong depth in our Antarctic and Southern Ocean capability, then we don't have a very strong voice on the international stage. And this is something that the recent meetings with Foreign Affairs, they've actually picked up on, and they're very keen to support the Gateway story here in Christchurch. And the final point is that we actually need to redefine our city. Now, I'm not talking about creating a Guggenheim type museum for the city, but actually it's about reinventing the city and actually taking advantage of the proposition that we have in terms of our historic and our future relations with Antarctica, and actually helping redefine our city through the Antarctic lens. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're developing a strategy, and I'm very keen, and my team are very keen as well, that what we don't do is produce a report that just goes and sits on a shelf. So what we're intending to do is actually look at the specific actions and the milestones that are required in order to reach those particular outcomes that we've just described. And more importantly, what we're going to be doing is actually providing a context in which some of the key agencies can actually make decisions around how they're going to contribute to those visions. The important thing as well that the Antarctic Office will be doing is actually this continuous public reporting and monitoring of how we're progressing against this. Of course, we'll work with the agencies in terms of their own implementation, but I think we as an office have a public responsibility to make sure that the whole community actually understand how we're shifting that curve and how we're developing that value as well. So in terms of how we're going to be doing this, over the next couple of months, the team and I will be holding a whole series of workshops. We're very keen to involve as many people as possible in the definition of this strategy, and that also includes people beyond Christchurch as well. So we'll be talking to central government, we'll be talking to Auckland, we'll be talking to people in Dunedin. So we'll be holding a whole series of workshops, but one of the things that I learned through this type of process is that people often have ideas beyond the initial workshop. So we're also looking at trying to create this digital engagement particularly through our own website, where people can actually participate in the development of the strategy. And as we start to develop specific components of the strategy, there's an opportunity to comment on those as well. So I'm very keen to make sure that it's just not a one-off opportunity. Through October towards February next year, we want to be able to embed those action plans into the various key agencies. And people will start to see the reality of what this means for the changes that we're proposing. And then from February 2017, we'll be looking at actually monitoring and reporting on the strategy itself. So a very short time frame, but I think the key thing is that I haven't encountered any resistance around some of these outcomes. People are very keen to actually progress on the outcomes, and people have got lots of ideas. So I'm very confident that we can move very quickly on this. As I mentioned, we are going to be using the website, particularly as a way of communicating and disseminating information. And I'd just invite you to have a look at the Antarctic Office website and sign up, and so be part of that process as well. So in summary, what we're trying to do here is really enhance Christchurch as New Zealand centre, and I stress that. So we're not looking at the local issues, we're actually looking at New Zealand's gateway role. With a focus on Christchurch. And we're looking at the creation and delivery of Southern Ocean and Antarctic innovation, knowledge and information. So again, it's about creating value. And we'll create that value by being internationally recognised as a city that actively supports Antarctic and Southern Ocean endeavours. We're going to add some depth to the New Zealand capability and credibility on Southern Ocean and Antarctic issues so that we can have a very strong voice on the world stage. We're going to look at how we can maximise the economic development opportunities available in the city. And we're also going to look at increasing awareness of Antarctic and Southern Ocean issues in the community as well. And we're going to do that through providing leadership through the Antarctic Office And it'll also be through a whole range of collaboration opportunities as well, because one of the things that's really important with this particular strategy is it's not up to the government, it's not up to the City Council to actually drive this. It's actually up to all of the agencies and all of the key stakeholders. So that requires a lot of collaboration actually to drive the outcomes. So that, I know it's quite quick and we've covered a lot of ground, but I was really keen just to present the vision about where we're going to go with the strategy and then the sort of the pathway ahead. So happy to take questions.